Welcome back to the Deal Mastery Insider. Today we're going to unpack a simple but important concept, which is the difference between EBITDA and SDE. So let's jump in. And to start out, obviously, here's a disclaimer. When you're doing deals, you need to do your own homework. There's a risk of loss. It's really important to pay attention to the details, which is one of the things I want to unpack here, which is earnings, right? If we're thinking about the valuation of a company, earnings really has a number of different potential definitions, but the two most common proxies that you'll see for a business's earnings are EBITDA and SDE. They're both pretty common. Neither of them is perfect, and I could give you a whole essay-length diatribe about why you would want to use one or the other, why EBITDA is not a great measure of cash flow, etc. But for better or worse, it's one of the most commonly used. And so I think it's important to understand each of these puzzle pieces. So let's start with EBITDA. You'll hear this thrown around a lot. You probably know what it means already, but if you don't, it stands for earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization. That's the definition of EBITDA. SDE stands for seller's discretionary earnings. So SDE is also extremely common when you're looking at business valuations, especially in the SMB market, especially for deals that are doing less than maybe $500,000 or maybe up to $1 million of earnings. Oftentimes those deals will get lumped into the SDE bucket as opposed to the EBITDA bucket. Not always, but in a lot of cases. And SDE, we'll talk about when to use one versus the other, but SDE is most commonly used for smaller businesses and owner-operator type businesses. But how do we think about the difference between these two things, right? SDE, the easiest way to think about it is it's basically EBITDA plus the owner's salary and the owner's benefits added back in. And I think this visual is a great way of understanding the difference between EBITDA and SDE, and the fact that SDE is pretty much structurally always going to be a larger number than EBITDA. Because for SDE, you're taking EBITDA, you've got earnings, interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization. That gets you to the EBITDA number. And then we add in the seller's income, any benefits associated with the seller, and any discretionary expenses that the seller has, and that gets us to the SDE number. So in the vast majority of cases, EBITDA is going to be a smaller number than SDE because SDE is adding all of those things back in. So the question we have to ask ourselves is, why are we adding those things back in? Why is it important or unimportant to add in all the seller's things? When would we do that and when would we not do it? The easiest way to think about it is generally for businesses that operate without the seller's involvement or that aren't as reliant on the seller. And in most cases, those are larger companies, right? So if you think about a business that's doing $5 million of EBITDA or $3 million of EBITDA and might have a team of dozens of people, it might have a whole org structure, might have a CEO, a COO, a CFO, an entire executive team, and maybe the seller is one of those people, or maybe the seller is just a board member or an investor and they're not even involved in the day-to-day operations. In that case, the earnings of the business are really going to be valued on a standalone basis because the seller's not involved. Conversely, if you look at a really small business where the owner is intimately involved in the day-to-day operations of the company, in a lot of cases, they're really just taking most of the profit out for themselves. And so in those instances, you'll use SDE to value that business. And the way you look at it is, my general rule of thumb is the more reliant on the business or the more reliant on the seller that the business is, the more likely I am to think about SDE being the right multiple to use or the right earnings metric to use. The smaller the company, the more reliant it is on the business owner, generally you're going to lean more towards SDE. And so despite the fact that SDE is going to be bigger for small businesses, generally SDE multiples are lower than EBITDA multiples. And so they're sometimes similar, sometimes can be kind of apples to apples comparisons. But the bigger the company gets, if you just think about it mathematically, the bigger a company gets, if a seller's taking $100,000 or $200,000 salary, let's just say $200K. If a business is doing $2 million of EBITDA, that salary is 10% of EBITDA. If it's doing $4 million of EBITDA, that salary is 5% of EBITDA. If the business is doing $300,000 of EBITDA, that salary is almost 50% of EBITDA, right? So it's a huge number, or it's over 50% of EBITDA, excuse me. It's a huge number, right? And so the smaller the business is, the more the owner's comp is going to matter, the more reliant the business is on the owner, the more you're going to use SDE, which is adding the seller's earnings and their benefits back into the earnings calculation, because in most of the cases when you're buying an SDE business, a lot of times it's being bought by somebody who plans on operating the business, whether it's a searcher or somebody in the ETA community. They're typically going to take that business over and operate it themselves, right? And so that's why you'll often see SDE being used as the valuation metric for these smaller businesses. And again, SDE might be a bigger number, but SDE multiples are typically much lower than EBITDA multiples, which results in most cases in SDE being a lower total valuation number than an EBITDA number might be. So that's how to think about the difference between EBITDA and SDE. Neither of them are perfect, but you might hear them both being thrown around. Sometimes you'll hear them used synonymously. Sometimes you'll see people conflating the definitions to try and get to a higher earnings number. And really, at the end of the day, especially as a buyer or an investor, you just need to ask yourself the question, what are the earnings of the business going to be after I pay for the management of the company? Or am I planning on running the business day to day? And if so, am I going to be taking those earnings for myself? And as long as you pay attention to that, you have a plan, you have an understanding for what the management and the cost structure is going to look like after you buy it, you'll be in a pretty good position to get the right valuation number and ultimately decide on the right earnings metric. So hopefully this helps you think about the difference between EBITDA and SDE. As I mentioned, they're both useful, they're both imperfect, but it's helpful to understand what each of them means and what each of them does. I hope this is helpful to you, and I'll see you on the next episode of the Deal Mastery Insider.